Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Michael Inslicht is a research excellence faculty scholar at the University of Toronto. His primary appointment is as professor in the Department of Psychology, but he's also cross-appointed as professor at the Rotman School of Management. Michael conducts research that sits at the boundaries of social psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience. His most recent interests in terms of research have been in the topics of self-control, where he borrows methods from affective and cognitive neuroscience to understand the underlying nature of self-control, including how it is driven by motivation. Michael completed his BSc in Anatomical Sciences at McGill University in 1994, his PhD in Experimental Psychology at Brown University in 2001, and postdoctoral fellowship in Applied Psychology at New York University in 2004. He's published more than 100 peer-reviewed journals, articles, and book chapters, and edited 2 books. His work has been featured in media outlets around the world, including the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, BBC News, Time, the Daily Telegraph, and CBC, among many others. He is currently an associate editor of Psychological Science. And lastly, Michael is a first-generation college student. And because I've never actually called you Michael before, I will say Mickey. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Nick. I don't think I've ever been introduced by you before. So, thanks for having me.
Weird, right?
Yeah, a bit weird.
So the one, I guess the one for listeners, the one piece that was missing in that intro and very impressive bio is that Mickey is a damn fine advisor and has mentored a number of graduate students over the last 15 years or so, including me. So yes, this is an exciting episode because Mickey was my PhD advisor. And so this is going to be a different approach. Like, you know, you're the first, no, I can't say that. You're not the first sort of quote unquote real academic. I've had Dilip and Mike on the show before. But this is going to have a different feel, I suspect, than most of my other episodes. So, but I think listeners will be really interested.
Yeah, well, I guess we kind of know each other a bit more than some of your other guests. So, and I guess I was involved in some of your formative training, so it'll be a bit different in that regard.
Exactly. And so there might be maybe a little bit more honesty, maybe a little bit more openness in terms of our exchange between one another. No yelling, though, I'd imagine, though, right?
No, I don't think I yell at my children. And although I think academics often talk in parental terms about their mentees, I don't think I've ever screamed at you, and I hope not to do that today.
Good. Okay, so lots of different directions that we can take with this. You know, I figure one of the main themes we will touch on in our conversation is going to be, you know, this sort of relationship between doing psychology and behavioral science in the lab within university institutions versus doing it outside in the real world, and how do we actually do that, and what does it mean to do that? But I figure what we'll start as just a step in you know into the room is there's 3 preprints that I came across in the last couple days as I was just beginning to think about our conversation today. One of them is yours. That was a recent, and it's called, the working title right now, which is being led by your current graduate student and friend of mine as well, House Lynn. And this is titled Promises and Perils of Experimentation. Big I Triangulation Offers Solution. So that's the one. The second is one from Will Gervais, and it's also preprint, and the title is Practical Methodological Reform Needs Good Theory. And then the third, which stands out, is Probing Ovulatory Cycle Shifts in Women's Preferences for Men's Behaviors. So all of those are touching on a theme here, and we'll get there, but let's sort of slowly get there, I say. So let's start with the ovulatory cycle shift one, because that's an interesting one. Can you, for listeners, because I doubt they have probably come across this research, Can you give a just a quick summary of maybe the history of that research and why it's particularly interesting here?
Maybe you're kind of putting me on the spot since I haven't read that preprint, but I think
I haven't either. I've just read the abstract, but in terms of the work that we did when I was in the lab.
Right. So I saw the headline of that preprint. I think is it not accepted in Psychological Science? I believe that paper.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the idea here is some evolutionary psychologists have argued and supposedly shown that women's preferences for men in heterosexual relationships, that their preferences change over the course of their menstrual cycle. And I believe that around the time of ovulation, they prefer men with certain features. And to be honest, I don't know what those features are. I guess they're facial features of some kind, perhaps projecting masculinity and virility, but I'm not sure if that's what it is, in fact. And can you correct me there, Nick? What?
I think yeah. It was there's been a whole slew of papers in the last 15 years on that, but one of the findings was during ovulation, it was sort of your more, for lack of a better, more accurate term, your alpha male, so more masculine. More dominance features, both physical and behavioral.
Right. So this has been a kind of found a lot of support for this over the years, but this preprint through a rigorous round of replications was unable to find the same sort of preferences among women across the ovulatory cycle when they, I'm imagining, measured that ovulatory cycle with precise means. Now, I think the reason you're asking me about this is because, of course, we ventured into this territory a little bit, although we never published anything. And I think our question was, because I'm very interested in cognitive control and effort, and I think we just had a more basic question, which was, do women's executive function, does their cognitive control actually change over their menstrual cycle? And we thought perhaps it would be, was it going to be sharpened or weakened during around ovulation? I forget now what the direction of our hypothesis was.
See, so do I, and I think that's the problem. I think back and maybe I was a little bit sort of caught up in that work. I thought I found it so intriguing. And so maybe I was a bit biased in starting to run some of those experiments and what we would have expected to see. And before I sort of go into like what we did just quickly is I think the one study that really made its way into popular media was women wearing more makeup and wearing more jewelry during their during peak ovulation. Which I know that has failed to replicate as well. So most of my understanding, I know there's been a big, a couple big meta-analyses from Marty Hazelton and team and another team. I think overall, my read of it is the effects might be there in some instances, but that they're extremely small. But in this case, it's, again, it seems to be that it's they're failing to replicate some of the basic effects. And in our case, we ran an MTurk study first. I'm trying to think back now, and we saw in the direction of improved cognitive control on certain behavioral self-control tasks. And then we took it into the lab, and I believe we found the opposite, that there was less control. And then we went to investigate using a neuroscience technique with EEG, and the results were all over the place. So hence why we didn't really publish anything.
Right, and I think as well, to even operationalize ovulatory cycle, there are various better and worse ways of doing that. And I think there's what's called a counting procedure, where you have women report when they first started menstruating, and then you count backwards. And but apparently it's a pretty inexact means to determine when a woman is ovulating. And then we went to a far more exact method, which actually involved women doing a bit of a pee test. Essentially, you have to pee onto this one strip, and then we apply a bunch of chemicals to it, and then we can determine whether they're actually ovulating. And that's a much more exact method. But when we use that method, things went sideways, and we couldn't really find much of anything. So I think we just kind of dropped it because it wasn't at first our main line of research, and we didn't know what to do with these kind of super messy results.
Yeah. And I remember, like, just logistically, it was an absolute nightmare trying to coordinate, a group of young women, bringing them to the lab, giving them these pee sticks, telling them how they're supposed to do it, when they're supposed to do it, sending them the reminders. And then attrition was a big problem because they just gave up on doing it, because they had to send us emails every day to tell us what the results were as they were approaching, their midpoint of their cycle or approaching ovulation. So yeah, I'm I think back and I go, God, why did I ever do that? It was such effort. But now seeing this paper come out and showing that even some of the more basic effects can't be replicated is interesting to see. So let's change gears to something that's more in your wheelhouse. So this recent preprint, what was the inspiration for talking about experimentation? To be honest, I've never heard you talk about this. Is this sort of in the last 2-3 years since I've been gone? And yeah, whose idea was this to start talking about?
Yeah. So so this is the preprint that was spearheaded by my student Howes Lin and co-authored by a current postdoc Caitlin Werner, and I'm the senior author here. But really, I should say this is really Howes's paper. This is he wrote this and thought about this and read about this for a long time, and it does come, though, from conversations that he and I had been having over the past few months. But it also comes, strangely enough, from my own podcast with Yoel Inbar, where we both read this one book called, I think it's called something like The Rise and Fall of Social Psychology, the Use and Misuse of Experiments. And the argument that and this is written by a Canadian sociologist named Augustine Brannigan. It was published, I believe, in 2004 or something like that. So pre-replication crisis. And he made the provocative argument that we went to, as a field, we went to experiments far too soon, and that we now rely on it too heavily. And that in essence, we use it with some famous examples, at least. We use it as theater. We use it as drama, as a way to dramatize and to make scientific seeming our lay intuitions, and that truly, again, his argument is that we haven't derived too much beyond folk wisdom from the use of the experimental technique. Now, this is a radical argument, and it's not one I'm necessarily sure I totally believe. But nonetheless, Howes kind of looked at that book and many other sources, though. So, I think Richard Feynman, the famous Nobel-winning physicist, he argued something very similar. He argued, that social scientists are cargo cult scientists. They use the forms of science. It looks sciencey from the outside, but when you probe deeper, you're like, what's going on here? Are they really, accumulating knowledge? So, in the paper, I think we put forth an argument, and again, I've got. I'm not sure how much I agree with it, to be honest, but sometimes it's worth kind of testing out ideas and seeing how it fits you. And the idea here is simply that there's nothing wrong in particular with the experimental method. In fact, it probably is our best method, especially in terms of inferring causality, in terms of inferring cause and effect. But it's one of many tools that we have at our disposal, and that it should not be overused, and it should not be used too soon either. It should be many methods should be used, and perhaps we should be using observation, description, simple correlational studies, qualitative studies before we get into experiments. And I think what we're saying is not radical in that sense. Because I think a lot of probably especially applied researchers would be, well, of course, we've got to know the lay of the land. We've got to, if you're, let's say, a behavioral scientist working with a corporation, trying to solve some problem. You first observe the problem, trying to understand the problem, and speak to many, as you would say, stakeholders, who are interested in the problem. Observe, describe, and only then will you then maybe bother running an experiment. And I think in academic circles, in social psychology especially, but other branches of psychology as well, I don't think cognitive science is guilty of this as well. We kind of rushed into running these experiments that we simply confirm what we thought all along. And because we've got this, this veneer of science, we can say, well, science, science approved idea here. Look, and then we just kind of reaffirm our lay intuition. And, part of the critique comes from a radical notion put forth by Bill McGuire, where he suggested that all hypotheses are true. That's a kind of crazy thing to say, right? But all hypotheses are true under some circumstances, right? So as long as your hypotheses are derived from propositions or assumptions that are logically hold, then the hypothesis is bound to be true, at least under some conditions. And what we then do with experiments is we find those under some conditions, and then we run the experiment, and then we proclaim some universal truth. We proclaim, look, X leads to Y, universally. And we don't think about what are the constraining situations, or is it, true in this other situation or not? So this kind of goes hand in hand with some hand wringing that a lot of us have been engaging with lately, which is the kind of this crisis of, some people are calling it a generalizability crisis. This notion that we can't really say much general or global from our small little experiments. So this is kind of taking that problem and saying that experiments might be especially guilty of leading us to make these grand claims. I think when you're doing more descriptive research or correlational research, I think you end up being a bit more circumspect, a bit more qualified in your statements, and as a result, you don't try to make these global claims. And I think with experiments, you tend to think of it as a magic pill to some extent, and then you kind of fall prey to, we misuse experiments. So it's not really that experiments per se are problematic, but especially when you pair it with questionable research practices, when you pair it with the fact that we don't pay attention to our null results, then experiments can truly mislead us.
Okay, so I'm curious. This is really interesting because when applied behavioral science and behavioral economics really took off in the real world, in governments and in industry and organizations, one of its supposed advantages, or why people really liked it, was because you could do experiments. Because you could, to some degree, infer causality. But here you're saying that there should be that we might have actually over-anchored on experimentation, and even going like in our own field of psychology, if you didn't have an experiment in a paper with a set of studies, forget it, you weren't going to be published. So do you think that we sort of incentivize the wrong practices, or at least we should have been more open to including even qualitative work in addition to quantitative work?
Yeah, I certainly think that it would have been good, and it's not too late for us to include other methods, other ways of knowing, description, qualitative studies, observational studies, correlational studies. So other fields I think are doing a lot better than us, like personality psychology, where they've relied much less heavily on experiments, largely due to the nature of what they study. But I believe they have a robust and reliable science, much more so than social psychology does. We've said that one part of the problem is our over-reliance on experiments. I don't want to kind of poo-poo on experiments here. It is a very good way of knowing, but more that we should be thinking about other ways of skinning the cat, other ways of knowing, of studying what we want to study. And each mode of study has weaknesses. Each have holes that they cannot see. So a big thing with experiments is the artifice, the artificiality of it. especially the kinds of experiments that I do, where we're in a really, really confined lab setting. We're trying to, in some ways, create a mini world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we hope that in that mini world, we can then generalize from that mini world to the real world. So as a real example, you and I, we ran some studies on ritual. I mean, you ran studies on ritual, and I kind of just gave some comments here and there. And in order for us to kind of abstract, to kind of get at to distill out the pure essence of what a ritual was, we took ritual away from its context and meaning, because we want to see if it was something about the mere acts, these kind of repetitious movements that you might share with a group that could have its, lead to the benefits that we see with ritual. So we created what we called minimal rituals. And then we ran some studies, we found some results, and that were, I think with some of our results, they're kind of mixed, right? We found some positive results. We also found some null results. And, that was one way of doing it. But another way of doing it, which is what the anthropologists had been doing, which is kind of actually observing ritual in action, real life ritual. We might not be able to make the same sort of causal claims that we want to make, but we can see how it's practiced in real life, in the real world. And I'm not sure that we glean any more useful information from our little impoverished study, that I'm not sure how replicable those results are, because they were mixed to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. Versus what the anthropologists have been finding, or the evolutionary based culture evolutionists have been finding. Mm-hmm. We're essentially saying the same thing, but they're coming at it from deep observation, deep description, qualitative research, and essentially coming to more or less, we are essentially, our intuitions, our theories were coming from them, and then we are reifying them with experiments. Now it's real, right? Before it wasn't so real because people are using these impoverished methods. Well, no, they're not so impoverished. They describe something and they seem to get at something pretty well. And now there's something, people are calling, or describing what they call a causal revolution, and led by people like Judea Pearl, who's argued that we can actually infer a causality to an extent through observational data. We can make causal claims through proper modeling of observational data. And I sense that that might be a more fruitful avenue for psychology to go, because so many of the things that we care about in social psychology are not amenable to experimentation, right? Mm-hmm. So, but we thought, if we prime them, if we kind of give a facsimile of what it means in the real world, that's good enough. So we were interested in religion. Let's prime religion. Well, guess what? When you're priming religion among atheists, or even among religious people, you're kind of reminding them what they think of religion is. That's not a proxy for religion. That's a super, super impoverished version of religion. It probably bears no resemblance to what religion actually is. So in what way can we say we're studying religion by priming people with religion? It's foolish. It's a foolish enterprise. But we thought,
just to hold you there, do you like... There's an interesting history to psychology, coming out of the behavioral revolution into the cognitive revolution, where all of a sudden we cared much more about precision and mechanism and process, and peering inside this black box to sort of really unpack and look at the internal mechanics. And then did social psychologists lean too heavily on cognitive psychology and the cognitive revolution? Should we have sort of stayed closer to sociology and anthropologists and relied more on this observational stuff, just given the nature of the questions we ask?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I think at the very least we should have been using more methods all along, and we should have been wary of trying to recreate the real world in our lab, because I'm not sure how many insights it's actually provided for us. So just as some examples, right? So some of our most famous studies, so it's the Asch conformity study, where it turns out that when a bunch of people in a room say the wrong answer to an obvious question, where there's an obvious correct answer, and everyone gives the wrong answer, a certain percentage of people will conform. Did we need the study for that? Or did we already have that intuition already? We kind of knew that already, and now we've got an empirical demonstration of it. But like, did that give us boundary conditions? Did it give us true insights, or did we kind of know that all along? Same thing with the Milgram study of obedience, which was shocking and surprising. But again, Milgram came to that intuition about obedience to authority from also lay intuitions. He probably borrowed it from historical things that were happening at the time, where there was, Adolf Eichmann, who was a top person in the Nazi regime, was put on trial in Israel, and he said that he was just following orders. And then Milgram, I'm not sure there's a direct link there, but there was an idea out there, and then he created studies to recreate that, and he confirmed what he expected all along. So does that then explain what happened in Nazi Germany? Not really, because if you look at some of the things that were revealed in his study, they were so different from what happened in Nazi Germany. So, for example, Milgram found that the closer the punisher was to his or her victim, the less likely a person was to go all the way down to the XXX, shock someone to potentially to death or severe injury. Compliance with authority went down dramatically once the person could be seen. Well, guess what? In Nazi Germany with the Holocaust, you could see your victims. They weren't so far removed. Some of them were far removed, but many of them were not. Yet we still saw obedience. So we still saw, atrocities being committed. So even then, it was a very, very limited explanation. But yet, because we've got this imprimatur of science, this kind of stamp of science, we're like all of a sudden we're led to believe this real thing that we've discovered. And maybe it's real, but maybe we knew this all along to begin with. So I think a description should have went hand in hand with experimentation. I think another thing that we could be doing a lot more is maybe foregoing a little bit of explanation to begin with. Maybe we'd be better off just trying to predict things, just trying to help people make decisions. So I think that's unsatisfactory to many scientists because we want to know what's going on in the black box. Mm-hmm. But think of the power of just explaining things. Predicting things. So one could argue that a lot of personality psychology is we don't really know. I think we know a lot more now about why people are the way they are. But fundamentally, it gives us this immense power of prediction. So if you're an employer, it'd be really good for you to know the personality profiles of your potential employees. If you know that, you can make some wise decisions about who to hire and who maybe not to hire, depending on the role, of course. So we can make pretty good predictions there. And maybe we don't really know why someone who's conscientious is, potentially better at some jobs, and maybe someone who's extroverted is better at other jobs. But we can make those predictions, and we can help businesses make decisions that way. So I think there's a lot more room we can be doing a lot of things, and we don't need to rely solely on the experimental method. So I think it leads us astray.
Mm-hmm. And on that analogy of say personality and them, using other methods and having the predictive power and not only the explanatory power, what would be the comparison for say the social psychologists, or because we're interested in the environment, in the situation, what could we predict? Would we be predicting sort of the pressures of certain environments on people's behavior? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's a good question in terms of what we can actually predict. I mean, I think because personality deals with stable traits, we can now measure them. We can then make predictions about those stable traits. But is there anything preventing social psychologists who supposedly were interested in situations for cataloging the various kinds of situations out there? How about we just start out like, okay, situations with like more than 5 people. What happened? Like, what are the kinds of things that might happen there? I mean, I'm just kind of thinking out of the box. I don't really know, but I think we can start thinking about like the situations out there, including the social situations out there, and start measuring what those situations can do. The affordances that are there because of those situations. Mm-hmm. But measurement's really important there. Cataloging things is really important there. And then maybe we can make predictions about when person X is in situation Y, this sort of thing might happen. I think that's something we could do, and I'm not sure we've really even approached things in that way. Instead, we've gone straight to experiments. I've got a theory. From this theory, I'm going to drive an hypothesis, and guess what? I'm going to pilot my materials, and that's what a good scientist does, pilots the materials until you get what you expect, and you keep on, piloting, sometimes for many, many months if you're really rigorous, right? And what does it mean to pilot? It means to find the right IV, the independent variable, dependent variable combination, right? Such that you confirm your hypothesis. Oh, it's only when I operationalize my independent variable this way and measure my dependent variable that way. Now I'm seeing what I want to see, right? But is that IV DV combination that you've discovered, is that a true representation of all the possible IVs and all the possible DVs that correspond to your constructs of interest? Or is it just one way to get it? Right? A very specific, perhaps ungeneralizable way to get at this IV-DV combination. And then we go ahead and run. Now we're finally ready to run the full experiment, and we run it. And maybe because if we piloted well, we find what we expect. And this is even without questionable research practices, right? And we find what we expect, and then we claim victory. My theory has been confirmed. But my theory is not about some really, really mild, constricted thing. It's a global thing. It's a universal claim. But you haven't done that at all. You've just found a way to find a demonstration of what you expect. But you've ignored all the hard work that went into finding it, which is finding, again, what are the specific operationalizations of both your independent variable and dependent variable. So what we should be doing instead from that process is claiming something really, really narrow, really, really simple. But that's not something you can make broad claims about. You certainly can't go, for example, to businesses about, because you just made a really, really narrow claim. There's a lot of work to make the kinds of broad claims you want to make. But that's what we can do. That's what we can do with experiments, at least at this point. To make the more broad claims, we then find that one version. Let's find a second version and a third version and 100th version. And maybe that takes years. Maybe that takes decades to find that. That's really how we should be conducting our experiments. And that's really hard and difficult, and practically no one wants to do it because we haven't thought about science this way. We haven't thought about how difficult it is to derive generalizable facts. I think we thought of generalizable facts as being cheap and easy and coming from lay intuitions. Observing the world. Right now there's an industry out there, in political psychology, of like Trump studies. Let's look at some egregious thing that Trump does. I've got a theory now. It's not really a theory. It's something you've observed, and there's some intuition that you have about what will come, that will follow from that observation. That something that Trump has done. And then you observe something, and then you're going to go recreate that in the lab, and lo and behold, you find something. You make some generalizable claim. I'm not sure you're really doing science there. I'm not sure what you're doing. You're just.
I mean, it's taking like what we normally do as humans is like folk psychologists or lay psychologists, which you have an intuition, and but maybe the double-edged sword here is we social psychologists have this weapon or this tool called science. So whereas the ordinary person would infer or have an intuition and then do whatever they would with that, have a conversation, have a debate, whatever it may be, we then take that into the lab and, equipped with the weapon of science, can reify and make this thing more real. When in fact, like what you're getting at is it? Yeah, I guess it's real or true, and to the extent that it's being manifest or expressed in this impoverished laboratory environment. But is it real in any sort of meaningful sense in the outside world? I don't think so.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly right. And now, I don't want to lay all the blame here on experiments, because I think you could do the same thing with observational studies, correlational studies, field studies. But I think there you're dealing with the constraints of the real world already, right? So if you care about, let's say you care about educational performance, right? And you go out in the field and actually measure educational performance. Well, guess what? Your dependent variable is real. It's already there. And if you can move that thing, well, then you've already accomplished what you want. But now, of course, you got to think about your dependent variable. Your independent variable. And what are you manipulating there? And is what you're manipulating, is is it similar to how it will be done in practice, in reality? Let's say if you create an intervention, right? But there, I think you have fewer degrees of freedom. So therefore, you're staying closer to the ground truth. Whereas, the kinds of facsimiles of the real world that we create in our lab have so many ways you can operationalize things. And they start losing they stop being in touch with the real world. But we assume that there is generalizability there. So I think, again, with observational studies, you're closer. You can be potentially closer to the ground truth. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm not saying abandon experiments. Hardly. I'm just saying, and maybe I should really be more specific and say lab-based experiments. I'm just saying they can be overused and they can also be misused, and we need to be wary of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, last question, because I don't want to keep you beyond time. What it seems like what's the end goal here, though, right? Like as scientists, whether we're scientists, like basic research scientists in university institutions or practitioners out in the real world, working in government or businesses, like, is the end goal here to learn something that's real or true about human behavior in the real world? Because I think back to like my time in academia and the incentive structures that are built in universities. There's a lot of academics who I know care just about getting at certain quote unquote truths through laboratory experiments. And they could give two shits about how that actually generalizes out into the real world. And often that conversation is actually completely missing. But is it incumbent on, like, should we have some sort of responsibility as scientists, psychological and behavioral scientists, to all align on the mission that we do our work so that we can improve the welfare or at least just understand human behavior outside in the real world? Should that be the goal for every psychologist?
That's a good question. I'm not trying to go that far. I think there is certainly a place for theoretical research, building knowledge for knowledge's sake, and it might not help humanity. Although you kind of ended there by saying, does it help us understand what it means to be human? I think we should all be working towards that, right? As psychologists, at least. So understanding the mind, that's our goal. Now, not all of that is applied. Some of that could be theoretical, but there needs to be at least some group of people, maybe a larger group of people than are currently out there, that are trying to bridge the theory to the practice. And we can't be left in a situation where we assume all along that these things will translate to the real world, because it might not. So I just want to give you one example. And I'm not exactly sure what to think about this just yet, but I'm going to give you kind of an extreme version. All right. Mm-hmm. So I study, and I know you've studied a lot, this one very, very famous test in psychology, perhaps the second most famous test in all of psychology, called the Stroop task, or the Stroop test, where participants are given, and it's the second most popular, famous, because the most famous is probably the IQ test, or the various versions of IQ tests. The Stroop test or task is essentially a task where participants are given a series of color words, the words like red, green, blue, yellow, and they're printed or presented on a screen where the actual color of those words can either match the semantic meaning of the words, so red printed in red, green printed in green, or they mismatch. They're incongruent with the actual semantic meaning of the words. So red printed in green, blue printed in yellow, etc. And by having people name the color in which these words are printed or presented on a screen, but not read, you'll notice something very quick, and that is that people have a much tougher time when the semantic meaning and the actual color of the words mismatch, when they're incongruent, than when they're congruent. And then this has been known for 50 plus years. I forget now when, I think it was in the 1930s, I believe, when Stroop was, Ridley Stroop actually first discovered this phenomenon. And we've been studying it ever since. And I got into the scene, like, I guess in the mid 2000s, late 2000s, thinking about this because I was very interested in self-control. And this is thought to be a measure of cognitive control. And the reason it's thought to be a measure of cognitive control is because it's thought to take some attentional capacity to stay on task and to either remind yourself of what your goal is in this task. Your goal here is to name colors, not read words. But if you're a literate adult, you can't help but reading those words. It's automatic. It's an automatic process. And you end up reading it, and then the meaning interferes with the naming of the color. So you've got to do there's some mental process you need to engage in to do this task. And that process could be either just staying on task, paying attention to what your goal, what the task actually is telling you to do, or it could be ignoring the other bit of information, suppressing, inhibiting, this kind of automatic tendency to read words. And people have modeled this task in various different ways, and our understanding of the task has evolved over the decades. Okay. Now, I really like this task. It's robust. Everyone shows this effect, or nearly everyone shows the effect. You can get beautiful neural markers or neural correlates of this effect. So one we've studied, you and I, Nick, is of course the error-related negativity, which is a brain wave, literally a brain wave that's produced when people make errors on tasks like this. Now, I studied this task because I'm interested in self-control in the real world. And all along, I wrote papers, introduction to papers, where I said, we care about, whether people meet their goals of eating what they want to be eating, or exercising when they want to exercise, or staying calm with their kids when they want to stay calm with their kids, or doing their homework when they want to be doing their homework. So all along, I've been kind of analogizing, using this Stroop as an analogy. I'm studying the Stroop, but in reality, I care, or I think I care about this stuff in the real world, right? Mm-hmm. But now, it turns out, at least via some dimensions, there might be very little correspondence between how one performs on a Stroop task and how much self-control one has in the real world. But I have analogized at least for over a decade now, that there's this connection here. And just recently, relatively recently, we've discovered that there is zero or close. Our best estimate of the association between real world control and the control in this kind of artificial task is zero. That's our best estimate. And that's sobering to think about. Now, that doesn't mean that it was useless to study the Stroop task. Maybe there's some knowledge we're gained about like automaticity and control, or what it means to make an error and our responses to error. So these tasks, these artificial worlds might reveal some truths, but I don't know exactly how they reveal their truths if some aspects of them can't generalize to the real world. And maybe what I've just described is one way of establishing generalizability, and there are other ways. I just can't think of them right now. So I think I still am holding out hope that those are revealed real and true things about automaticity and control and the way the brain works. But I'm not sure. We haven't done. It's not generalizable enough for me. I've assumed that they too readily, transfer to the real world, and I'm increasingly doubting that it does.
You know what it reminds me of? What I hear you're saying is that it's revealed some truths about automaticity and the prepotent response of word reading and semantic activation, like some of these like really low level cognitive and perceptual processes within the mind and brain. No doubt, it has taught us a lot of the Stroop task. I mean, and these other similar laboratory tasks have taught cognitive psychologists a lot about the mind and the brain. But maybe that's where it should have stopped. Maybe the problem is the social psychologists or the organizational psychologists, the sort of the more the people who are dabbling in things that are, a little bit related to social, relationships and personality, things that are more abstract, more high level as opposed to low level. That's the problem. And it reminds me also of the mirror neuron stuff, where they found, these sets of neurons in the motor cortex of some monkey, I think, and all of a sudden that got into the hands of the social psychologists, and before you know, we're talking about empathy. And so I think that's a similar tale that we're telling here, is that keep it where it needs to stay, which is where maybe in like sort of low level cognitive scientists. And just be careful as it sort of creeps up and ends up in the hands of the social psychologist. Would you?
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense to me. I think social psychologists, I think we want to be describing again more reality based kinds of truths, and I think maybe it was us. We were the ones who were kind of arguing by analogy. And what does it mean to argue by analogy? It means we hope that this low level thing, or we think this low level thing, is actually saying something about a high level thing. We're conducting an experiment on one thing, but we're saying it's revealing truth about this other thing, right? So that's what generalization is. External validity is. And maybe the low level cognitive psychologists, they were less interested in generalizing. They're more interested in kind of staying within this small world because that revealed certain truths. I think I can buy your argument there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, one final question for you, Mickey, if you don't mind. After we've just basically concluded that my PhD was a waste of time. I'm joking. I learned a lot of things. But the last question is a big behavioral brainstorm. I ask all guests this, or the BBB. So there are a lot of problems in our world right now. Lots, it seems, more and more. Which one, if you had to pick just one, do you see psychology, behavioral science being the thing that can help solve that problem?
Oh man, that's a good question. I feel I've been in such a place of nihilism. I don't have much room for optimism. So I'm not sure. I'm going to answer the question I want to answer. How about that? Which is what I think are the pressing problems that I think we could be working on. And that's, I'm seeing a lot of now. I think our politics are to some extent have reached a point of breaking. There seems to be a lot of polarization now, and tribalism as a result of that, and I think that could be really, really bad for us as a society. Now, do behavior scientists can we say something about it? I know there's a lot of social psychologists who are studying this now. Will they derive solutions that are actually meaningful and helpful? I'm not sure. Maybe. I wonder, given that the tenor of our discussion up until now, if we should be more modest. I wonder if we should be trying to solve local problems. By local problems, I don't mean local to your city, but I mean really constrained problems. So I think, for example, you're a behavior scientist and behavioral scientist, and going into businesses trying to help them solve specific problems. I think we can totally help in that regard. So I was speaking to one of your lab mates, Rima Tepper, who works at the Royal Bank of Canada, RBC, and she is working, I believe, in the audit department. And one of the problems she's tasked with solving is how does she get, and these are internal audits. How does she get people who are about to be audited to be less fearful, less reactive? How does she get people to implement some of the strategies that audit people say are good to have good, let's say, accounting hygiene, right? That's a very small problem, local problem. By small, I mean, it's not a big, question about humanity. It's not a big truth about, the way you work, but it's a local problem, but an important problem for RBC and potentially a problem that has a big price tag to it. And if they solved it, they could save lots of money and prevent litigation, et cetera. I think a behavioral scientist can help. They can move the dial a little bit. Is she going to be able to solve the problem writ large, completely remove fear, completely increase adoption? No. But could she move the dial a little bit? I suspect yes. So I think those kinds of modest problems we can help with. I think we have the tools. And the tools there are not always experimentation, right? The tools there are just kind of basic understanding of reactance and fear. And, I think the work on nudging can help there as well. So I think we can, and also there you can run some experiments to see various interventions, what they might or might not work. So I think there I'm much more hopeful.
Yeah. Well, if there's sort of a common thread here, I hear what you're saying in the conversation is that there's a lot of things that have happened in academia with the replication crisis that are and other related things that are sobering for us as scientists, and it's good for listeners and the practitioners, the psychologists and the behavioral scientists on the practice side to come to grips with those things as well. And in fact, it's almost like the stakes are even higher in the real world just because of the types of problems we're actually dealing in. And my concern is that there's not enough of us on the sort of the practitioners who are aware of these problems and who are interested in these problems. But I think we definitely should be. So listen, thanks, Mickey, for walking us through all that stuff. It's really amazing, and I hope listeners will get a lot of it. So I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, of course, anytime, Nick. Thank you for having me on, and I hope it wasn't too negative for your listeners, because this is I've been sitting with some of this stuff for years, and it can be a bit of a slap in the face when you are first encountered with it.
No, we need I think what we do need in our field of applied behavioral science is a little dose of negativity. So it's always a good thing. Yeah,
negativity, or maybe I would use the word maybe humility, and knowing what we can and can't do.
Yes, good humility. Well, let's end it on that, on a note of positivity. We'll call it humility. Oh, thanks, Mickey.
Thank you.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.